There is no bar to knowledge greater than contempt prior to examination. In order to discuss the New Testament, we must agree to a number of assumptions. Assumption 1. Yeshua was a real, live, first century Jewish rabbi. Assumption 2. Yeshua was executed by the Romans. Assumption 3. By 100 AD, massive numbers of Gentiles chose death rather than renounce their newfound belief that Yeshua had been seen alive after his execution. Assumption 4. Yeshua primarily spoke to a Jewish audience. Assumption 5. Yeshua did not read or approve a single word that is written about him in the New Testament. Assumption 6. Yeshua's purpose was not to start a new religion, but to teach all Israelites how to properly read and interpret the Tanakh for themselves. Assumption 7. There are three major sects of Judaism in the second quarter of the first century: the Scribes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. The Scribes were the keeper of the entire written Tanakh. The Sadducees ignored the prophets, keeping only the Torah. The Pharisees relied on oral traditions, not the prophets, to interpret the Torah. Assumption 8. Yeshua taught that, intentionally or not, the scribes had changed the Torah, and each person is ultimately responsible for using the Tanakh to discern what was in the original Torah. Assumption 9. Paul was a Pharisee from youth until death. Assumption 10. Luke was an eyewitness to the teachings of Paul, but not to most of Paul's early ministry. Assumption 11. While most Jews of Yeshua's day could read, very few could write, and almost no Gentiles could do either. With these assumptions in place, let's go back to 33 AD. Yeshua has just been executed, and within a week, rumors begin to spread that he was seen alive after his execution. If these reports had only been from his followers, they would not have been found credible enough that over the next few decades, Gentiles hundreds or thousands of miles away would have chosen death rather than to sacrifice to their family or city idols just one more time. Jews and Gentiles alike wanted to know more about Yeshua and what he taught, so that their soul might also have a chance to live after their body had died. Other people sought to profit by making up or repeating rumors about Yeshua for money. Sometime between 38 AD and 50 AD, a letter begins to circulate attributed to Yeshua's brother James, stating Yeshua's teachings. A man said to be named Stephen, but who may very well have been Yeshua's brother James, that is teaching the Karaite way, is murdered by a group of Pharisees. One of these Pharisees was apparently named Saul. Saul, being at the minimum an accessory to this murder, changed his name to Paul and went into hiding, re-emerging among the Gentiles who were seeking to convert to the Karaite way of Judaism. By now, Paul's major concern was preventing as many Gentiles as possible from converting to Judaism in any form, even if they were descendants of Israel. Paul's teaching to the Gentiles was that anyone may be saved through grace by faith alone as long as you believe that Jesus died for your sins. In stark contrast to the corroborated eyewitness testimony of James, Matthew, and Peter through the hand of Mark, that the path to acceptance by God that Yeshua taught is strict Torah observance, and that the choice between life and death for our soul is made by our ability to forgive others as we would have God forgive us. Paul taught that you could follow Jesus without being circumcised, eating kosher, or any other thing that differentiates a Jew from a Gentile. Paul teaches his new Christianity at synagogues in Corinth, Thessalonica, and around Galatia, convincing many Gentiles to leave the synagogue and start home churches that follow his teaching instead of the Jewish practices they were learning at synagogue. When the letter of James arrives at these churches, the elders Paul had put in place demand Paul respond to the differences between his teachings and what James says his brother taught. Paul's responses to these churches are documented in Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Next, Matthew the tax collector writes in Hebrew, and Peter gives his account in Greek through the hand of Mark, as independent and therefore corroborating eyewitnesses of the teaching and ministry of Yeshua. Both of these works have clearly been added to. The most obvious and glaring addition is the entire Last Supper. You can't have a Passover meal 2 days before Passover. Further, the Eucharist in both these Gospels was obviously taken from 1 Corinthians, as the Greek is virtually the same word for word, and 1 Corinthians was written first. As Jews testifying to what they had witnessed, neither Matthew nor Peter would have added to their testimony things they could not have first-hand knowledge of, including, but not limited to, Yeshua's genealogy, the temptations, and the trials of Yeshua. They also would likely not have testified to anything that occurred after the resurrection, as they were concerned with documenting Yeshua's teaching and ministry while he was alive, not anything that would have been a new revelation after his death. With the writings of these two Gospels, Paul now had many more contradictions to contend with, as there are now 3 widely circulated documents by eyewitnesses that contradict what he has been teaching for more than a decade. He enlists the aid of Luke, a physician that is traveling with him, to write Acts of the Apostles to give himself credibility by stating that Paul has interacted with the actual disciples and brother of Yeshua. Luke further copies either Matthew, Mark, or both, adding things that are useful to Paul's ministry, but were never part of Yeshua's ministry. Eventually, Paul's credibility gets so low, he writes under Peter's name a direct response to James's letter. Jude, another brother of Yeshua, writes warning of people just like Paul. Paul responds with his final writing, also under Peter's name, this time a letter designed to impersonate the letter of Jude. The New Testament closes with 5 works by a person claiming to be one of Yeshua's 12 apostles named John. But the writer of John clearly was not a Jew and therefore could not have been a disciple of Yeshua's. Paul, it seems, sees his message in life first as preventing the followers of the Pharisees, those who would become rabbinic Jews, from converting to the Karaite way, and once he was sought by Roman authorities, saw his mission change to preventing Gentiles from converting to any form of Judaism, Karaite or not, because his major concern was now about keeping the Jewish bloodline pure. God's purpose in creating the New Testament was to bring the entire Tanakh to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, no matter what nation they were living among. To do this, God needed to create the new religion of Christianity, because the people God had originally entrusted to demonstrate to the nations how to be acceptable before God chose to keep the instructions to themselves and make up oral traditions that negate those instructions. Instead of being the nation of priests actively inviting Gentiles to learn and follow the instructions given by God through Moshe, the descendants of Israel through the tribe of Judah and Levi have discouraged the Gentiles from following the Torah. It may be that because rabbinic Judaism, begun under the Pharisees, ignored the Karaite way as taught by Yeshua, for much of the last 2,000 years, God has made them an example of what happens when you know God's instructions and choose not to obey them.